And this is what I wanted to talk about this too before we ran out of time, is voxel-based dosimetry, right? And you were talking about the coldest part of the tumor. Can you go through some of those key variables? What is that? What do you call the coldest part of the tumor?
Sure. So there's two different ways that we look at it, and these are both kind of terms we stole from radiation oncology, where you look at something called a dose volume histogram, which looks at the dose at different portions of the tumor based on each voxel that the tumor is in, right? So the D1, which is the dose to the hottest 1% of the tumor, could be a bajillion gray, right? Where your D99, which is the dose to the 99th coldest part of the tumor, could be 1 gray. And you're not going to have a complete response. Right. Even though, you got a bajillion gray to 1% of it, the coldest part didn't, right? And so as we go through different variables, D25, D50, D50 being the dose to the, average or median, 50% of the tumor, we start to think about that. The inverse of that is something called V, like Victor, V whatever gray. So it's the volume of tumor that got exposed to a certain gray threshold. So V100 would be the percent of the tumor that got 100 gray of radiation. So V100 of 100% means the 100% of the tumor at a voxel level got 100 gray of radiation.
Right.
And so D100 and, V100% are the same, right? And so we can use those interchangeably at that high numbers. But I think, looking at D95, so the coldest 95th percentile of the tumor, is super important, particularly these big tumors, to better understand what your radiation doses are.
And you alluded to this too. Bigger tumors are heterogeneous, right? And so we know that there's going to be some areas that are going to take a lot, some areas are going to take less. And so your paper said your target dose to the D95, the coldest area of the tumor, should be 719 gray?
Something like that, yeah.
I remembered it.
Okay.
So it was, but I think that's important. We saw similar stuff. We recently looked at our own data and put out some stuff, and we saw similar outcomes. We didn't actually do all the fancy statistics that you did, but it's about upping the dose. So 400 gray to the perfused territory is our new minimum to go for. But when we're talking about dose to tumor, we need that dose to tumor be dramatically higher, right? And so that's why that 600 to 800 that we were talking about when we first got into this, when we're talking about rad-seg, is critical, because especially for these larger tumors, and I don't think we appreciate it as much, these larger tumors are going to need hotter doses in the coldest areas. So we have to raise our dose to get that there. And that's why I think we see good results with 600 to 800 gray.
I have a question. How are you even determining the histogram? I mean, how are you determining the cold parts of the tumor?
Software has to do it, and it's based on either SPECT or PET, because it has to create a dose volume histogram, which is a lot easier to see visually. But it has to go through at a different voxel-based level based on your SPECT or your PET and actually calculate the dose.
Are you suggesting that, software should be used for most dosimetry?
For your 2-centimeter tumor, no. Right? We have very good methods of doing it, 600, 800 gray, keep it easy, right? But I think it starts to break down a little bit once you have, tumors that are pretty much your entire perfused segment, right? And so, I would talk to you and you would say, I would just give 800 gray instead, right?
I don't find the need for it.
It makes sense.
I don't find the need for the software, and that to me just results in me going home later from work. It doesn't, to me, it doesn't add
from
benefit.
a practical standpoint.
From a practical standpoint, if you can target 600 to 800, and by cold and hot, a lot of it now becomes your particle load issue, right? If you're inserting a 3 GBq vial, which is 750,000 particles in a 7 or 8 centimeter tumor, you're going to get some heterogeneous distribution. You're going to get cold spots. So how do you fix that? You don't increase the dose. You just increase your particle number, right, to get you a better spread.
But I guess
instead of going from 3 to 7 or 10.
Yeah, well, I think what Zach did, I think, not to get too far off, Zach and us, we don't do that. I don't use software to plan my dosing. I did it to justify why we saw things in the real world the way that we do, right? I don't have the time or the energy to go back and actually overlay all my spec CTs and make sure everything's registered right. But I do want to understand why I'm getting great results at 800 and I'm not necessarily seeing the same results that I would have expected for legacy at 400, right? If I did 400 to the perfused territory and I didn't get 100% CP, and maybe I was treating a larger tumor that had more heterogeneity. So I wanted to explain findings in the real world, which is why I went and looked at it. So now I dose at 600 to 800 gray to the perfused territory, which is practical. I'm not looking at dose to tumor. But I also think there's a point in time where you can only pack in so many spheres. I think it's a flow-dependent phenomenon, and I think that we're always going to see heterogeneity even when you pack in more spheres. And I think you see that in some of those resin papers that looked at the same thing. Their D95 was dramatically lower than their median perfused dose, similar to what we see with glass. And so we have to, at some degree, there's a balance between how hot your spheres need to be and then how many spheres you get, to your point.
But to answer your question way back when at the beginning of this, it's going to help us give us a cap for how high we need to go. We don't need to go to 2,000 gray. We don't need to go to 3,000 gray. And so it'll at least give us a better target of where, by experience, you're realizing we need to be at. But for someone who's out there saying we need 2,000 gray of radiation, you could say, maybe
I don't think most people are advocating routinely going to 2,000 gray. When does these 2,000, 3,000 gray happen? It happens when you're ultra selective. Your perfused volume is 20 cc's, and you're giving a 3 GBQ vial. You'll start to get 1,500 to 2,000 gray, depending on the day of the week, because as Kirema said, you're there in a certain day of the week, right? So because that's when you have your lab time. That's when we start seeing, in practicality, when we start getting doses in the 2,000 to 3,000 gray. It's because that's just the volume.
But I guess my question is, why not dose everyone at 2,000 gray?
What we're doing works in 97 to 99% of the time, right? So I would rather focus our energy on fixing variables that need improving, which that doesn't seem to need a significant amount of improvement at this point.
Can I just say one more thing going back? Because we were talking about software versus not using software. I think there's definitely a role for it, but I think even, we've honestly been a little bit of later adopters of the software, but I still kind of, when I'm thinking of tumors like this, I'm still kind of thinking multi-compartment in my head, right? So I'm thinking, okay, so I see just from visualizing, just from my cone beam CT, the specs, so I can kind of get an idea of, okay, so this part's hotter, this part's colder, so how am I going to target this? Am I just going to give more particles, higher specific activity? Am I just going to try to split it into 2 vials or 3 vials to get whatever I want? So I think there's ways of doing this that's not necessarily understanding the concepts. Of course, it's not, as we won't get the dose volume histograms, but you can still really understand the tumor, the flow, and kind of try to at least target those thresholds without necessarily having the dosimetry.